We have a very exciting discussion lined up today where we're talking about building blocks and blockchains and how to avoid fragmentation in the global trading system. So my name is Stanley. I'm the live journalism editor at Coindesk. And I'm going to introduce my esteemed panel here quickly. This is Behlendorf, the executive director of Hyperledger. We have Thérèse Couture, who is director of Treasury operations at the World Bank. We have Gert Sylvest, who is the co-founder of Tradeshift. And we also have Gerry Mattios, who is the executive vice president of supply chain and global trade at Bain Company out of Singapore. So I'm going to turn to Gert first, and just kind of setting the table. When we talk about fragmentation of global trade, like help us kind of define what problem are we addressing here, and kind of set the table for how blockchain factors into a solution here.
So happy if anyone wants to chime in, but I think there are a range of issues, and maybe on the high level you could say is there equal access to get the same kind of value out of trade for all the participants in trade, and I think there are numerous kind of types of fragmentation here. So I think on one side you can look at the digital divides, so the companies that are engaging in e-commerce trade that is quickly going global, and the companies that are not. There are trends of regulation, for example, in tobacco industry and other regulated industries. That means that companies that are not very advanced, either on the compliance side of things or in the digitization space, will have a hard time being participants in advanced supply chains. I think there's a split between, let's say, small and medium-sized companies and the large enterprises in terms of, what's the cost of access to capital, what are the opportunities for access to market, and access markets outside of your global markets. So there are a range of these kind of issues. And you asked about blockchain. I think one of the uniting trends in the use cases of blockchain is to kind of play with the idea of removing some of the middlemen in the trading systems and give people access to have an identity in the trading system and new ways of distributing the value that comes out of the trade relationships. So that's some of the promises, at least.
Great. Gerry, did you want to add anything just from your vantage point at Bain, working out of Southeast Asia? How are you seeing this problem of fragmentation in your day-to-day operations?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having us here this morning. I'd like to say that right now, globally, we see about a major gap in trade finance, about $1.5 trillion, which is particularly affecting small, medium enterprises. These are the small companies in e-commerce that are trying to trade with customers all over the world, and in some ways competing with the larger corporations. The larger corporations can develop their own platforms. They have the resources and the capabilities to do that. But the small medium enterprises are the ones that are getting quite hurt right now. So DLT, we see, can come in and solve quite a few of those issues. For example, around credit letters, around documentation on ingredients or different certifications that are required for the products to travel. However, it's not a solution to everything, and there needs to be a lot of collaboration around that.
Great. So over the past year, I think there's been a lot of conversation around what is the actual utility of blockchain in a lot of these instances. And I think some people might be wrestling with the question of, is blockchain this sort of revolutionary, game-changing new tool, or is this just sort of a new type of database that has some incremental efficiencies and other aspects that we didn't otherwise have? So maybe, Brian, if you want to touch on that point a little bit.
I think the answer is both, in the same way that the internet was just another new kind of network that had, networks had existed for quite a while before the internet came around. I think in 2019, when we use the word blockchain, we're not so much talking about the cryptocurrency thing anymore. I mean, that's there. There are lots of potential use cases for that. But we're really also talking about the enterprise use of distributed ledgers as DLT, as was said. And for that, you can do all sorts of automation with smart contracts. And with those two pieces, you can build KYC systems, you can build distributed workflow systems that all rest upon this notion of coordinating a network of peers with very lightweight kind of coordination at the center, rather than having to depend upon a central 800-pound, gorilla at the center, whether that's a government or a Silicon Valley company or a market maker or some other sort, right? How do you tease these apart? And in trade finance, it's been clearest that you need something like this, a cooperative network, because there is no single global authority in international trade, right? It's different jurisdictions, it's different types of, obviously, currencies, it's different regulatory regimes. So blockchain technology has really come to shine in trade finance, in supply chain traceability, in a lot of these kind of global contexts first, because it has the strongest problem around who do we trust to kind of be that point of authority? No one, so let's distribute that authority and have a system that we can collectively trust, even if those of it, as individual companies, we can't necessarily trust each other, right? That's really why blockchain technology has really shined here.
Great, great.
Can I just add, sorry to...
Yes, please do.
What I think is great about the technology as well, being disruptive, the blockchain, but what it's also doing is it's bringing organizations from around the world that are working together that might not necessarily have done that without this impetus of having a new technology. And people are coming together to address common issues and with a sense of common purpose. So I think that will also have the potential to have greater impact.
So well, on that front, talk a bit about what the World Bank is doing. You guys have established a blockchain lab, there's some proof of concepts, issued a bond. Talk a bit about what some of the exciting projects underway there.
Absolutely, there's a lot of exciting things going on. But first, I just want to explain briefly what the World Bank is about. The World Bank is an international organization, a multilateral development bank, and it has the twin goals of eradicating extreme poverty and promoting shared prosperity. So everything we do is about the development world and development work. And basically how it works, and linked to the Bondi blockchain, for those of you who know that we issued in August an actual transaction using blockchain technology, but we issue bonds in the capital markets. We use the proceeds of that to provide loans to governments that then invest and support development work. So we partner, the World Bank Group partners with the governments and partners with industry, academia. So one example is what we're doing in Haiti at this point with mangoes and avocados. So Haiti, of course, is a poor country, and the farmers today have a difficulty connecting with efficient markets. And so their part of the revenue is a fraction of the selling price. And so this project looked at, it did a study of the whole process, the end-to-end chain, the value chain, and bringing improvements to the process, collecting data, using visibility, traceability, and transparency. So bringing all these efficiencies so that the participants along the chain can see all of the transactions, all of the data across the chain. And so this started off as a pilot. And one interesting thing they did a trial pilot using QR code, so quick response code, putting the QR code on the mangoes or the packages of mangoes so that the end consumer can actually scan it. And with that, they're brought to a web page, and they can see everything from who the farmer was, where the location is, when it was picked, the temperature of the storage, the transportation, the price as it goes through the value chain. It also allowed the farmer to maintain ownership throughout the chain to the end point. So all of this, with all of these efficiencies, the farmer now has a much fairer portion of the revenues. Now, all of this now is, the next step is bringing all of this collection of information and data points using blockchain technology. So that's the next phase of this project. And so it's really exciting. It's in line with the World Bank goal of promoting shared prosperity. And so that's one example. There's many examples in other areas.
May I add a point here? I think what the World Bank is doing is fantastic, and we see, I've heard about this pilot, so I'm very glad it's worked, because especially on food supply chains, this is a major issue around traceability and visibility. But what we do see is that there are a lot of pilots that are happening around the world with different type of solutions, different providers, different suppliers. The question now is how we're going to be able to scale that up. and who's going to take the first bet to scale up some of these solutions. And whoever does that first inevitably will also set the standards for others to follow and for small and medium enterprise to sign up to it, and so on. One point I want to highlight is that besides the collaboration between government, banks, and the players, we also see certain economies, certain governments taking a very sort of a front step on developing trading platforms within their economies or within its free trade zone. We have Dubai doing this with Blink. We have Singapore doing this with the network trade platform. And I think those type of platforms could be also a big game changer to be able to incubate blockchain solutions, startups, and help companies trade in a more secure and more transparent way as well. So I think the emphasis and focus a lot on collaboration amongst multiple players before we start seeing that scaling really happening.
Exactly. And to that point, sorry, we started on purpose to have a smaller test use case, so that we could understand the challenges, the risks, the opportunities. And really, this was an opportunity to connect the farmers to efficient markets. And so as what you're saying, this is kind of a starting point, and then how do you scale up and continue the collaboration and bring in all of the partners you need, whether technology, logistics, et cetera, to...
So on this question of adoption, a big question I have is, well, it seems like there's a bit of a paradox here, a quandary in that the folks who are on the SMEs and the small entities on the tail ends of the supply chain are the ones who would most benefit from these types of digitizations, but they also face the highest sort of barriers to entry. So it would be great to get some thoughts on how do we sort of bridge that divide there.
Sure.
Let Gert go ahead and then,
okay.
Brian.
Thanks. Yeah, so I love the example from the World Bank. And I think one of the things you often forget is how many resources companies, both the small and medium-sized companies and the large companies have in the supply chain, but largely a lot of those resources are totally invisible. And one example is, of course, receivables. So in Tradeshift, what we do is digitize supply chains in the cloud. So today we move $500 billion of mainly receivables and purchase orders in the cloud. And these are really resources to the companies. And today, you mentioned the gap in trade financing, that those resources, they are not really exercised in an efficient way. They are basically invisible in the supply chain. And the only one really gaining the benefit are the ones that can expose them to a meaningful way in the financial system. And I think one way of thinking of the whole blockchain space is kind of world's biggest economic laboratory. And if you've seen anything, whether we are looking at world trade bonds or ICOs or crowdfunding or digitization of assets, it's this idea of breaking down the silos of how you could exchange different kinds of values. I think that holds a very interesting perspective to actually exercise those resources of small and medium-sized companies in the supply chain. If you can take those and digitize them much like you did with the bond example, you're creating a whole new kind of financial market. And I think that holds benefits both ways, because in a way, if you can exercise those kind of resources, you're giving an identity to those participants in the supply chain. And that has impact for the large companies as well, because I think one of their challenges is basically, how do I source quality materials from across the world if I don't understand what are the kinds of goods I'm buying and who am I buying these kind of things for? So I think it goes hand in hand, and there are large synergies. But until today, we have not had good ways of sharing in this kind of value that is created in the trade ecosystems of trade, I would say.
Sure. Brian?
Two quick examples. In Singapore, the Development Bank of Singapore worked with Agricorp in a project representing 4,500 farmers in Australia, connecting to, getting access to credit, getting extensions of letters of credit, doing the whole trade finance kind of thing, along with a startup called DLT Ledgers, also based in Singapore. In the first 2 months of production operation at the end of last year, they extended over $750 million worth of credit over this system. Not a large number of trades, about 2,500 trades, but each of those was about $300,000 of value. That's now grown to 6 additional banks, and each of those banks represent sets of investors, sets of traders, right? Agricorp plans to also expand it now to their peers, as well as to a larger pool of their own farmers. So these things can grow quickly with just enough critical mass to get a market going. In China, within China, there's a network of banks, China Minsheng Bank, People's Bank, CITIC Bank, who are now doing 1 billion renminbi a day in letters of credit and trade extension and traceability. So these things, they can pick up steam. And all you need is just enough critical mass to get a liquid market together.
Great.
Can I
Gerry?
make just one final point there? It's amazing how, I think, if I can use an analogy on how small medium enterprises are thinking about going on the cloud or using online platforms, a bit like 10, 15 years ago, people using the credit card to buy things online. They were very hesitant about the security. So actually, small companies are equally hesitant sometimes to put everything and trust a platform or any type of online collaboration to put in some of the most important items such as receivables, their invoices, even their IP to be shared with blockchain. I fully agree. We will start seeing a step change as systems become more secure, as they become more trustworthy. But more importantly is we have estimated at Bain that about 50 to 60% improvement in operating costs can come through the adoption of distributed ledger technologies for supply chain. If small, medium enterprise, even large companies can really understand the concept of how these cost reductions come, which is basically through better paperwork, better working capital, lower processing times, and so on, that could be a real trigger to help start accelerating that adoption of blockchain.
Right. Gert, you want to add to that?
I think that's a really good point. I think one of the challenges that kind of stands between that and enterprise adoption is, I think to some extent, is understanding how this is a different kind of economics thinking in this as well. So, we've been trying to digitize supply chains for the past 40, 45 years. And in reality, there's virtually zero adoption between companies in the big picture, if you look at kind of percent-wise on the transaction volumes moving through. So it's not because of lack of technology or lack of standards, sure. But I think it's every single participant in the ecosystems of trade asking themselves, what's in it for me to digitize and change my ways of working and so on. And I think that's the fundamental opportunity that we're facing. That is, if you can think a little bit different of the economics here, you can actually create real incentive for companies to join into digital trade. And I think that holds enormous potential for the enterprises, which are some of the main beneficiaries as well of the digitization and increased efficiency and agility.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that we really have, with the sort of the advent of blockchain DLT solutions, we really have the impetus for sort of new types of business models and collaboration models that really wouldn't have been possible 20, 30 years ago, or that it just would have been foolish to engage in this type of sort of collaboration or partnership with perhaps your competitors. So it's really forcing companies to kind of think differently about how are we collaborating, what's our collaboration versus competitiveness sort of ratio. I'm kind of curious to know, what role do we see governments playing, and I guess other international institutions such as the World Bank or the WTO playing in this? Do they have a sort of a catalytic role to play here? How does the role that they would have to play perhaps different from the role they've traditionally played when it comes to sort of setting global standards and incentivizing certain practices? Gert?
Oh, sorry. Okay, just super short. So I think one thing that's often overlooked when you speak about blockchain, that's the kind of good old-fashioned practices that you need to engage in, and that's the basics of digitization. How do you agree on common standards and common processes? Because it doesn't matter that you have this fantastic technology if we don't agree on, what is a receivable, what is a bond, what is the role of different participants in an open account financing setup. So, and I think governments have potentially a huge role to play in driving this kind of standardization and laying the groundwork for we actually understand what is the kind of information we are exchanging between each other. Mm-hmm. I think there are good examples of that.
Yeah, I agree. And of course, with the technology, the disruptive technology, which is also changing operating models as we're talking about, what can happen is, the industry, as the operating models are changing, there's new standards, new principles upon which this is based. And the government has an important role as well, because sometimes the legislation or the regulation needs to catch up with what is changing in these business models. So the government has an opportunity to facilitate some of the efficiencies that are being brought about, but also ensure that the legislation continues to protect the consumer. And so I think the government has a great role in this.
Yeah. Brian?
If I can add, so we've at Hyperledger worked closely with Hong Kong Monetary Authority, with MAS in Singapore. We actually have a trade trade finance working group that is chaired by somebody from the Bank of England. All of these organizations, all these regulators are realizing that they have a big role to play, and that a lot of the promise in efficiency gains comes from actually hooking in the customs authorities, comes from hooking in all of the different approvals that it takes to move product from one country to another as full-fledged participants in these networks, right? As well as having a front row seat to observe these networks for any types of attempts to game the system or front run or that sort of thing. But I think it's also important, and we've had governments come to us and say, well, should we be the governing entity on a network, right? Because every blockchain network is going to have somebody like a We.Trade or a neutral kind of consortium, right? Very much that. In fact, we call them consortium chains sometimes. That acts kind of as the referee, sets the standards, sets the kind of the criteria for joining. And in the event where there's a bad actor, what's the process for weeding them out and making other parties whole, right? You can't avoid that kind of thing. I think it's really important that, and I think the industry has spoken that it's important that these organizations be neutral, that they be somewhat global in context, that they be replaceable in case they make a mistake, right? Just like you should be able to fire a referee from a football field if they make bad calls, right? And therefore it's important that that governing entity not be a government. Because if they mandate you use their blockchain, right, to do business on that network, it might as well be a centralized database.
Yeah. And maybe just to add to that, I think in the last 5-6 years, what we've seen happen with the trade facilitation agreement is sort of a mini version of what I think we're all describing here. I think government's playing a role of facilitating the reduction of supply chain barriers to trade, which we've been talking about for a few years now, that are far more efficient and to the economy than trade tariffs. But they've been doing that through the referee, through facilitating, through promoting infrastructure investments, through public-private partnerships and so on. I fully agree that it's a little bit, I think governments will always be playing catch-up when it comes to technology, and they shouldn't be the ones deciding the technology. That's not the role they have to play. But they do have to be the adult in the room, let's say, right? Someone who will be able to call out people, call out the bad actors, and kind of set the guardrails of how things should be operating. And again, my previous point, some of governments like Singapore, Dubai, we see that doing that with their trading platforms that are trying to develop through their free trade zones, and I'm sure other governments potentially will follow up.
So given that there's some degree of relinquishing of control for these entities, so on the one hand, they can see some of the potential efficiency gains and some of the benefits, but on the other hand, they see like, well, we don't have as much control as we maybe did once before. So is that really the sticky point when it comes to engaging governments on these issues? Is it they're uncertain, they're afraid of embracing something that they may not be entirely sure what it is and how it works, and it also involves a loss of control and autonomy in some sense?
I think one of the reasons why loss of control presents problems in ordinary settings is that sense of lack of auditability, right? If you give up control, does that create more windows of opportunity for bad actors to get illicit product to market, to avoid taxes, to avoid following the rules on the ground, right? And there, to a large degree, distributed ledger technology can help make it harder for bad actors to get away with what they'd like to get away with, make it harder to forge paperwork on a container as it's coming from source to destination, right? Make it easier to try to trace, even statistically, here's a middleman operator who is distributing a lot more product than they're taking in. That might be worth taking a look at, right? And so if we can bring the same degree of auditability, transparency, and kind of an ability to help make sure that the good actors are rewarded to a system where the government doesn't have to be in a central role, they are willing to kind of give up that that sense that they have to, have complete visibility or complete control over things.
Sure. Great. So I want to go back to the trade finance question again here, and Gerry's this is something that Gerry's been talking a bit about, and so Bain has estimated there's a $1.5 trillion gap in trade finance, and that's supposed to increase by another trillion over the next 5-6 years or so, and I'd really just like to get a bit of extra color from the panel about, what is the potential for blockchain? How do we use blockchain DLT solutions to really just inject more liquidity into these supply chains? Because I think if you're able to reduce the level of working capital, if you're able to find new ways of monetizing assets that were previously unmonetizable, we're talking about very tremendous. Supply chains comprise about 2/3 of the world economy. So we're talking about tremendous economic gains here, tremendous prosperity gains. So we'd love to kind of get some additional color on just what type? How does this work in practice?
So,
Please, go ahead.
yeah, so again, I think the World Bank example of tokenization of bonds is a great one because it shows how you can take a real-world asset and you can create a digital representation of it. And again, I think so many resources are held up by companies, for example, in the shape of receivables, that are not being exercised today. So, there are so many inefficiencies in the way that companies trade and settle, that, between East and West, it can take even 10 days to settle an invoice. Between that, you have outstanding payment terms of 30, 60, 90, and even beyond that. When the financial crisis hit us, we saw this spike to up to 12 months. So the liquidity gaps that you see within the individual players is quite enormous. So I think there's big potential there. So I think one of the kind of taking the blockchain to its max, imagine that you can actually, in a free and global and frictionless way, exchange these digital assets in financial services markets. And imagine that instead of taking your portfolio of receivables and binding it to some receivables financer for a 6 to 12 month period, that you have the flexibility of swapping this in and out pretty much by the hour. I mean, if you could achieve that kind of efficiency, I think the difference in the cost of finance between large enterprises and small and medium-sized companies, you could put that on a level footing, and that means basically releasing some of the potential in, I think it's 2.5 trillion according to some estimates, but if you widen the definition of what is actually the gap in liquidity and the access to finance, we are up in the $7 to $9 trillion range. And I think it's all about the liquidity of those assets, which today is very, very low.
Yeah, I agree. And one of my favorite applications of where it can help is on turnaround times. So typically it would be, we go from 5 to 6 days of working out payments to a few hours potentially. And then also minimization of errors, or even right now, a lot of small medium enterprises, again, I like to focus on that because it's the real driving force that gets the pain of the 1.5 trillion gap. They have a lot of errors in invoices. It could take 3-4 days before it goes to the Philippines, get processed, they send it back and forth. With the application of blockchain and a variety of ways to apply that, that can come down to minutes, or no errors at all, ideally. But when they do exist, it will come down to minutes. So when you add all these together, more efficient turnaround times, lower working capital, lower inventories, less or no errors in processing, that provides an amazing economic opportunity for all trade players globally.
I just want to add as well, when you have the supply chain on blockchain, and you can have real-time information about where your shipment is, if there's an incident that occurs that you have to manage, if there's something wrong with the transportation, for example, you run into some issue, some challenges that are delaying it. When you have that information at hand and available to the participants, you can react quickly. So you can manage the risks right away, redirect, hire whoever you need to fix the problem, and so you can react quickly, which again will reduce the costs.
Exactly.
Great.
If I could have another example of this. So on the Food Trust Network, who has anchor participants like Walmart, it's a food traceability and largely a kind of network, largely as a way to address imperfect product in the market, things like E. coli and lettuce, as a way to more narrowly figure out which farm or which processing plant might have introduced that problem. They are now mandating that this year all of their tier 1 leafy green suppliers be on this same network at Walmart, so that they will have that traceability. And then in subsequent years, tier 2 suppliers, so they'll know, was it the processing plant, was it the farm that put this bad product in? And it's related because right now they find E. coli in lettuce. All lettuce or cabbage or other leafy green product from California is thrown away for a period of a month or two. And that's tremendously economically expensive.
Right,
so, in addition to the trade finance opportunities, other use cases like supply chain provenance weaves into all these and itself provides a lot of economic.
Sure, just on the waste management front, essentially.
Exactly.
Right. So, well, we're running out of time here, but just to wrap up here, so in 30 seconds, would like to get everyone's thoughts on, in the next 12 to 24 months, what do you see as the biggest development or the biggest sort of catalytic event on the blockchain supply chain front? Brian?
Simply more testimony from the networks that have been stood up and starting to generate actual trades, starting to generate actual value. That'll win over kind of the second tier, kind of mid-stage adopters, I think, who are ready to deploy the technology, ready to work with cloud providers and others who can turn on nodes onto these networks pretty quickly. And we'll see a real head of steam start to develop as critical mass is hit in markets across all sorts of products. So I'm really excited about that.
Great. Thérèse?
I think what we're going to see is the benefits of the transparency that this technology brings, because when you're providing information to the participants, it brings trust, it brings economic growth, and everybody wins.
Yeah.
Gert?
I think there are some interesting developments in terms of representing real-world currencies on blockchain, and I think that can help drive real settlement between companies of any size, because you're not tied to a volatile cryptocurrency, for example, and that means basically programmable contracts between companies. And let's say a programmable invoice is pretty much as good as money. So I think that's one of the things that could help drive actual volume.
I have one wish and one prediction for that. So one wish is that we get over these current geopolitical trade challenges that we're seeing, so we can have a little bit of stability, because that creates a lot of instability in many ways within supply chains. And the prediction on the back of that is that I think in the next few years we'll see AI and machine learning taking a real sort of a prominent position in supply chain design and the supply chain developments, whether it is through payments or the actual movement of goods. And that is partly because of the trade challenges we have now. We'll again start seeing trade lanes changing potentially through maybe new deals that will come through or negotiations or that sort. And as companies go through supply chain reinvention programs, I think scenario planning through AI and machine learning will come into that, and of course will affect payments and all these things we just discussed today. So that'll be very exciting to see how that plays out in the next 2 years.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for your time. Our time has expired here, but I just want to thank the panelists for a wonderful discussion here. Thanks for your presence this morning. And have a great week at Davos.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Thanks for having us.